Good evening, everyone. I'm so glad that you are able to join me tonight for the Wired for Fear, Not Fun webinar. Before we really get started, I'm going to just do a couple of housekeeping announcements. Certificates will be issued in the next 2 to 3 weeks, and they will be sent to the email that you registered with. So if you are logged in for at least an hour and 15 minutes of tonight's webinar, you will receive a training certificate reflecting the length of the course, which is an hour and a half. And that will come again to your email in the next 2 to 3 weeks. And any other housekeeping questions that you may have, I will answer by email, or you can go in the chat box and someone here at Harmony Family Center will answer that question for you. So I am Allison Douglas. I am the training coordinator here at Harmony Family Center. And what I do here is I spend most of my time working in training with caregivers, parents, teachers, and other professionals that work with kids who have trauma backgrounds. But the majority of my experience and the way that I really approach parenting and parenting education is from my life. I am the parent of 4 kids that I've adopted through foster care. So I really do approach this material from a place of application and understanding, and how having a firm grasp on neurodevelopment and brain growth and brain development can really help us parent our kids more effectively. So the kids that I parent range from 16 to 7, and I have 2 boys and 2 girls. And so my husband and I really entered fostering without the intent to adopt, but we know that plans certainly change in the child welfare system. And I feel like it really has been my life's work parenting these children, and in turn learning from so many folks who have helped me on my journey, and then sharing that with other families. Really, the material that we will talk about tonight draws on those very professionals that I just spoke about, and professionals that I feel like all foster and adoptive parents really should be familiar with. And so the work that we talk about tonight is drawn primarily from Dr. Bruce Perry's neurosequential model of therapeutics, but also a lot of this material comes from books that really any parent can understand, like The Whole Brain Child by Dan Siegel. And it is a really thin little book that talks to parents and caregivers about how children's brain development can be optimized, and how we can use what's going on in kids' brains to help them grow, especially in the areas of discipline and how we interact with our kids. So discipline and attachment. Also, the work of Besser Vander Kolk is a part of this too. His book called The Body Keeps the Score is definitely a little more intense than The Whole Brain Child, but what it does is it helps us understand how trauma affects kids, not just their behavior, but their bodies, their development, and their growth in general. So my own background, besides parenting, is in Montessori education. I was a kindergarten teacher for quite some time, and then moved to parent education. And then in the past year, the agency that I work for in Knoxville, Tennessee, Harmony Family Center, has had the great fortune of studying directly with Dr. Bruce Perry. And so I was able to do that for the past year and a half. And I am certified in the neurosequential model therapeutics phase 1. And I'm currently pursuing phase 2. And so that allows me to do more training of other trainers and professionals. And so That model of the neurosequential model of therapeutics is really at the heart of my current parenting and professional approach. And the truth is, when we have a better understanding of neurodevelopment, we can have a better understanding of behavior, and especially the effects that child maltreatment have on our kids. And these really include things that often are not thought to have such long-term effects. So as a very green foster parent, I really thought of things like neglect, or a biological mother who was very stressed out or had prenatal nutrition. I really thought of those things as having negligible effects on children. But we know now from the amount of study that's been done in this area that these really do have long-term effects, and they affect children's behavior and their health and their long-term health and mental health. And so we're going to spend a great deal of time tonight really looking at how the brain develops, what that means to our kids and our families, and especially in the context of the holidays. And then we are going to talk about some tools that we can use when life inevitably gets squirrely with our families and our kids. So I want to make sure that we understand this way of looking at neurodevelopment is very, very broad. There are folks who spend their entire careers and lives studying neurodevelopment and brain development, and tiny little bits of what we'll talk about tonight. You know, there are folks who have written books on just how parts of the brain grow. And so I want you to know this is a really, really general overview of development and behavior, but it's a great way to really understand our kids. So many of us approach the holidays with this image of perfect celebrations, of big family dinners, photographs in matching pajamas, going to parties with friends, church services, these stacks of wrapped gifts under the tree. However, when you are parenting kids who have been through trauma in their early years, the holidays feel a lot more like this. And this is how I feel about my kids today, is that, yep, we're merry and bright, but they have had some moments of being little gremlins. And so tonight we're going to spend some time digging into why the most wonderful time of the year, in quotes, can be so hard for our kids, and to look at some ways that we as parents can make the holidays less stressful and more peaceful, which is always my goal as a parent, is to make every day less stressful and more peaceful. So I want us to begin by really reflecting on the complexity of the human brain. You know, the brain is what mediates our thoughts and feelings, the way we make connections with other people and with our world. We know that the brain is made of about 75 to 100 billion neurons, and those are connected by trillions of synapses or brain connections. The brain is faster than any computer ever invented, and it is infinitely complicated. However, as complicated as our brains are, even the most unscientific among us can really understand the concepts that we're going to talk about tonight. So I really don't want you to be scared if you feel like, I'm really not a science person, I'm not sure I can understand this. You absolutely can. If I can understand it, you can understand it. And even more importantly, if you can understand it, your children can understand it. And so we can talk to our kids when we have a good understanding of the brain about what's going on with them and help them to be more self-aware. And so the way we're going to approach the topic of brain development is by really breaking it down into this handful of key points. There's really two key points that we are going to talk about in brain development tonight. And we're going to start with the idea that humans possess a genetic range of possibilities, right? So Dr. Perry wrote that human beings are the product of their genetic potential and how that potential is expressed is a function of their experience. So what this means is the raw genetic potential that we start with, we get from our parents. And unfortunately, we do not have any say over that, right? We do not get to choose who our parents are, how intelligent they are, what they look like, what their biological predispositions are. We just inherit that. But how that potential is developed and used is really all about our life experiences and what we're exposed to, including the experiences that we have prenatally and in the earliest weeks and months of life. And so this is a base point, is that we all have some raw genetic material and we work within that framework, but outside of that factor, everything that we're exposed to and all of our experiences leads to how our brain develops. And so this is really our first key concept, that brain development is use dependent. And we are going to watch a very short little video from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. And this is really going to talk about how our experiences shape our brains and the architecture of our brains. Okay, what I'm hearing is that the video isn't showing up on your screen, and that's fine. That there's no sound for you guys, and that's okay because this video is actually really easy to find. You can find this video on YouTube. So after the presentation tonight, just go and check that out because we're going to talk about what's in the video. I just love having that ability to use multimedia, but as we know, sometimes things don't work as we hope. So what we're going to think about with use-dependent brain development is that in utero and through the first 4 years of life, kids' brains are developing more rapidly than any other time in the lifespan. That is so fascinating that before the child is even on the planet, through those first few years of life, their brain is developing faster than any other time in their lifespan. And the way that their brain is organized then is a direct reflection of that child's environment. And this is because the physical connections between brain cells, which we call synaptic connections, increase and strengthen through experience or use, right? That's why we call it use-dependent functioning. And the more an experience is repeated, the stronger that connection becomes. And here in this image, you can see here are some neurons, the blue bell-shaped cells in the brain, and those little dots are the synaptic connections beginning to form. So you may have heard the idea of synaptic connections forming through experience expressed in the phrase neurons that fire together, wire together. That's a pretty common phrase. The importance of this is that every experience, every thought, every feeling, every physical sensation that we as humans experience trigger thousands of neurons which form that neural network. So when an experience is repeated over and over and over again, the brain learns to trigger these same neurons each time. So the more an experience is repeated, the stronger the brain connections become. And so patterned, repetitive experiences build these neural networks. So what that means in just really plain language is that experience, what happens in the life of an infant, actually creates and organizes the child's neural system or their brain. So this concept, I think, really made sense to me when I heard it in the context of what really happens in infancy when we think about infants. So positive, responsive, predictable caregiving in that first year of life, and also prenatally, creates the neural networks for healthy attachment, right? So mom soothes the baby, she rocks the baby, she meets her baby's needs over and over and over again. And what happens is the baby builds this internal template. And this template says, adults are safe, all of my needs as a teeny tiny baby will be met, that I have the ability to be soothed, that the world is okay. And so the baby's experience of having care that is responsive and predictable creates the internal network for this child and their beliefs about caregiving. If the caregiver regularly provides this baby with a consistent and rich somatosensory experience, so things like this bullet point here, list here, if mom is rocking that baby, helping the baby to dance and playing with the baby, giving baby movement. If the baby is not hungry, if he is full, if there are things in his world to see, if someone is touching him, if he has physical contact, and his life is generally warm and comfortable, this provides the patterned repetitive stimulation that organizes the regions of this little guy's brain that then interpret and regulate sensory input. So another example of use-dependent brain development is the way that undifferentiated neural systems develop. So what an undifferentiated neural system is that in the beginning of brain development, when the cells are immature, the final location of specific cells and what their specialization is hasn't yet been determined. And so in order to fully mature and organize, these systems depend on cues from the environment. So when kids have these appropriate, patterned, repetitive experience, their brain becomes organized in a healthy way. If these cues don't happen, so if the kids have disrupted experiences, they are sometimes being cared for appropriately, other times there's no caregiver. Sometimes they are fed, other times they go hungry for long periods of times. Then what happens is these immature brain cells, the ones that haven't yet developed in the systems that they will eventually, they don't migrate to the right region. So they don't specialize appropriately. And this results in compromised brain function, right? So where these cells would typically move in the brain and what systems they would set up, that just doesn't happen because the cues that they need have not yet occurred in the child's life. And one of the things that we know, and that I think is just incredibly important, is that we know self-regulation is really closely related to early developmental experiences. So children without that patterned repetitive caregiving, children whose caregivers cannot read their cues, maybe don't know when they're hungry or they have an inability to meet their needs, these kids don't develop well-regulated stress responses, and they have such a lack of ability to interpret and understand the world around them. And eventually, what happens is that they have difficulty regulating themselves and regulating their bodies, and they have behaviors that we find really challenging to parent, right? So these are kids who every little frustration causes them problems and challenges. So Dr. Perry says the majority of brain organization takes place in the first 4 years of life. This is why trauma and neglect have a disproportionate influence on brain organization and later functioning when they occur in the first 4 years. So this idea really flies in the face of conventional wisdom. So many of us believe, so many folks who work with children, even in the child welfare system, believe that kids are resilient, that there's something inherently resilient about them, and that if they can't remember what happened to them, it shouldn't affect them. But the truth is that neglect, especially early in development, is incredibly detrimental to kids because what it does is it changes the way that the brain structures develop. And it can even alter the systems that regulate brain chemicals, things like serotonin. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later. But we know that these neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine have major impact on mental and behavioral health, right? Even if we are not incredibly well versed in mental health, we've all likely heard of things like serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are what a lot of antidepressant drugs are. And so we know that these brain chemicals change our mood and our behavioral health. So use-dependent development of the brain is one of the reasons why trauma in these early years is so very impactful. These experiences form the templates that kids use to really understand and interpret all of their future events through. And we, again, will return to this idea a little bit when we think about why the holidays are so triggering for many of our kids. So that first key concept in brain development is that brain development is use dependent. The second concept that we're going to look at tonight is that the brain develops from the bottom up. So brain development begins in the lowest regions of the brain, and then it progresses from the bottom up, organizing from the least complex to the most complex functions. And so I love this graphic. This really helps me to understand that the effects of bottom-up development and what that really means for children. So let's look a little bit at each of the 4 regions of the brain that we see in this graphic. So the first area is that pink area. This is the brainstem. You'll sometimes hear it referred to as the cerebellum. And this is the first area to develop in the human brain. And this area of the brain really mediates mostly very primitive functions, things like our heart rate, our body temperature, and our blood pressure. But they are also the things that keep us alive, right, and keep us comfortable. If we have trouble regulating our body temperature, that can lead to a lot of challenges because of how important that is and how primal that function is in our bodies. The yellow section there is the diencephalon, and this is, again, this part of the lower region of the brain, but this develops after the brainstem. And the diencephalon really takes care of things in the child's life like sleep, things like arousal, how agitated they are, how hyper-aroused they are. Also, this is the part of the brain that mediates sensory integration. And so thinking about sensory integration, this is a challenge for so many foster and adoptive kids, is being able to integrate those senses. And so we see these first and the lowest parts of the brain to develop are the brainstem and the diencephalon. So one of the coolest things about the brain is that it has the ability to change. The brain can change throughout the lifespan, and we call this ability to change plasticity. And this is so good that we have the ability to change, that our brain is plastic, because at least for me, I really want to be able to continue to grow and learn and have new thoughts and understand new things forever. The thing about plasticity is that the lowest areas of the brainstem and diencephalon, these areas are not incredibly plastic, and they're the most affected by early experience. So we see I circled those in red there. The lower parts of the brain, they have less ability to change, and they develop first. So what that means is if these have not developed appropriately, they are much harder to change than the next two areas of the brain that we're going to talk about. So let's take a look at those next two areas. These two, the limbic and the cortex areas, are actually very plastic. The cortex is plastic likely for the entire lifespan of human, right? You can teach a 90-year-old person a phone number. They may not remember it forever, but of course I'm not 90 and I can hardly remember a phone number these days. But we are as humans have the ability to learn and grow even into late in the lifespan. So let's look at the green area. That's the limbic area. This area of the brain, this area really helps us to deal with our mood. It's in it's the emotion center. Of course, that's a pretty unscientific way to look at it, but this is where we see a lot of emotional regulation processes happening. This is where there's a lot about relationships and mood, and the reward center. So sort of what drives us? What things do we like? Are we willing to what are we willing to do to get to the things that we enjoy? And do we have the ability to do things like delay gratification? All of that happens in the limbic area. And the cortex, which we see as blue, is the most complicated of all the brain areas. And so this is where the processes of cognition, self-awareness, logic, communication happen. And I think of the cortex as what we are really hoping to modify through the process of schooling, right? We're hoping to change the cortex when we teach kids facts about history, when we teach them information and then say, now draw a conclusion about your own life based on this information that I taught you about an ancient culture. And so the cortex is the most complicated area of the brain and the most easily changeable. So as the cortex grows and develops, it actually is able to mediate and control some of these lower areas in the brain. And what we call this is cortical modulation. So what this means is, we may have a feeling when we are in line at Walmart waiting to check out that we would like to punch the person in front of us in the back of the head because they keep putting things on the belt. Right? We may have this feeling, but because we are healthy adults, our cortex says, this is just a feeling. This won't last forever. It's not a great idea, right? Our cortex modulates these sort of primitive impulses and feelings. But here's the thing. If there are factors that increase the activity or the reactivity lower in the brain, so things like chronic traumatic stress, things like neglect, traumatic brain injuries, then the cortex is not able to mediate the low brain. And so we often see folks that are impulsive, they can't tolerate frustration or discomfort, and they are literally acting without thinking. So when we look at the brain developing from the bottom up, we think it develops in complexity, right? So the lower functions are less complex, the higher functions are very complex. And if they've developed in a healthy way, those higher functioning areas of the cortex can really help us mitigate some of that more primitive impulsive stuff that goes on in all of our brains, but that we have great cortical modulation that helps us not to do some of that stuff. So how does understanding these two concepts about brain development help us to better understand our kids. In some pretty unscientific terms, what happens early in life, even prenatally, continues to ripple throughout this child's future, right? So let's look at how understanding these concepts of brain development play out in the lives of maltreated kids. And my guess is, if you're listening tonight, you are parenting children who did not have a good start in life, who, for whatever reason, were separated from their family of origin and have some form of maltreatment or trauma in their background. So how do these concepts play out in the lives of these kids we are parenting? So because we know that the brain is use dependent, we can understand that prenatal insults shape the development of the brain. As we said multiple times in the last 35 minutes, the period of the greatest developmental activity for the brainstem is prenatally. And so what happens to the kid in this period shapes structural development of the brain. So things like smoking, alcohol and drug consumption, even things like the well-being of mom, what her stress levels are, how she feels about her pregnancy, if she's being abused, these affect brain development and how that lower area of the brain functions. You know, so many foster and adoptive families feel that their kids have been with them for so long that they either don't have traumatic effects or they should be over their traumas or have learned enough new skills by now. But we know that the earliest life experiences shape the way that our kids approach the world. And this includes experiences in the womb of not having their needs met on a consistent basis, of being hungry, of being flooded with stress hormones. This shapes how our children behave and how they approach the world. And this is really challenging. I'm giving you all this information in a way that's very fact driven, but I want you to know I get how challenging it is to parent a child whose brain has been changed by neglect and by abuse and stress. And so it's really challenging for us as parents to look at our children and think that some of these behaviors that we are dealing with on a daily basis stem from a time that this child was not even yet born or on the planet. So what else does this mean for maltreated kids? Because the brain develops in a use-dependent manner, early neglect has long-term effects, right? It doesn't just impact that development, it also has long-term effects. Remember, there is nothing inherently resilient about kids. And the experiences that they have early in life are building the physical architecture of the brain. And so I don't want to start a video and have the sound not work. I will simply give you a couple of pieces of information from the video that I have on this page. Basically, Dr. Perry describes the children's brain as a history. It is a living history of what that child has experienced. And so when we can think of the brain as a history of this child's experiences, it can help us to understand that there are certainly long-term effects of the neglect and damage that's done in the earliest years. Because we know that the brain is use dependent, we know that experience shapes the brain. We understand that the structural templates for relationships are created really early in the lifespan. And we already talked about this when we saw that really beautiful image of the mother and her child. We see that these templates are created in the first year of life. We see this with attachment, right? Positive, healthy, predictable caregiving creates attachment. And so if that does not happen, this template for what relationships are supposed to look like, how adults and children are supposed to interact, is not as healthy as it should be. So we know and understand the attachment cycle, right? Mom soothes and rocks her baby. She meets his needs over and over again, and the baby builds this internal idea that adults are safe, that the world is a generally safe place. And we know what it looks like when that does not happen, when the child's needs are met inconsistently or not at all. Their brain organizes a template that they carry with them for the rest of their life, and they're comparing all interactions with adults against that faulty template. And that template tells them that adults are frightening, adults might meet my needs, but they might not, adults might help me, but they might not, and that everything about adult interactions with children is unsafe. This idea that trauma changes the baseline functioning of the brain is one that I really struggled with for a lot of years in parenting my own kids. But traumatic stress really changes the brain's baseline functioning, right? So to understand this, what we have to do first is really understand what trauma is. And what comprises trauma for young children. So I recently met with a foster family who had just adopted a child through foster care, and the child was having some behavioral challenges. And I was chatting with them about maybe looking at some of these challenges through a trauma-informed lens. And they said, well, this kid hasn't had any trauma. And so I really needed to go back and say, well, why is this child with you if they didn't have any trauma? And what I found was that separation from their parent or caregiver in this family's worldview didn't constitute trauma because it made the child safer. But what we have to do is really understand that for children, there are a variety of things that can cause trauma and traumatic stress. So we're just quickly going to look at this list of, well, what even is a traumatic event? What could cause traumatic stress in kids? The first three there, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect, these we're all familiar with, and we probably all would put in the category of trauma. But simple separation from parent or caregiver, being removed from your home, being removed from the orphanage that you grew up in, being removed from the people who really created your community is a form of trauma. Other forms of trauma that I honestly had not thought about before studying this particular way of looking at trauma in children is chaos in the home. So lots of moves, lots of people in and out, having needs met in chaotic ways. So at different times during the day by multiple different people, just having a general lack of stability in the home is a form of trauma. Witnessing domestic abuse and domestic violence is certainly trauma. Parental substance abuse and incarcerated parents. Things like accidents. So a child who's involved in a traumatic car accident, in a very violent car accident, this could be a form of trauma. Being involved in a natural disaster. When we think about national disasters of recent, things like Katrina, right? This is something that totally uprooted these families and children. So a natural disaster can certainly be a part of trauma. Bullying that is happening daily, bullying that occurs over a long period of time can be traumatic. There can be medical trauma, certainly violence, anything like war or terrorism, and then even other types of medical trauma that would cause pain. So a child who's ill and has lots of pain that's intense and unremitting, all of these can be considered trauma. So the truth is, most of the children that we parent have lived, or even some are currently living in, chronically stressful and threatening environments. So when we think about this, this graphic shows us the way children respond to trauma or the arousal continuum. So it starts with calm, right? This is where we want our kids to be. This is where we want ourselves to be, is calm. But as the child's perception of threat arises from any of the things on that list that we saw, and probably many more that we just didn't think of, then the brain begins to respond in an attempt to survive this incident. And so as the threat increases, our kids' bodies begin to respond and they move up this continuum. Their heart rate rises, their muscle tone increases, their respiration quickens. But threat responses don't just take place in low brain that controls those body responses. They also affect a lot of other brain systems, including those that are higher. And so we see and we parent children who moved up and down this arousal continuum many, many times in their short lives, sometimes many times a day, right? So a child who would wake up in the morning and be calm, hear yelling and screaming and have parents fighting, they may move all the way up to alarm or fear and then back down. And that may happen multiple times a day. And as that happens, their bodies are actually changing multiple times a day. Their bodies are trying to protect them from trauma. And in children, we typically see two ways that the body copes with moving up that arousal continuum, that their body copes with that kind of intense threat and trauma. And those two ways that children's bodies cope with trauma is hyperarousal and dissociation. And the body does different things in each of these threat responses. Hyperarousal typically looks like that classic fight or flight stuff. And this response is centered in the locus coeruleus, which is an area in the brain that plays a role in the way kids take in the environment around them. The locus coeruleus plays a part in things like agitation, stress responses, things like sensory processing. And so because that the locus coeruleus is connected to many other brain regions, and you can see in that green spot there, what we know is that kids who are hyperaroused, their locus coeruleus begins to function at a higher rate, and this affects the whole brain, right? It doesn't just happen in this tiny area of the brain. So that fight or flight response then begins to affect the whole brain. That secondary response that we see, the other response that we see in kids, is dissociation. And this strategy to cope is incredibly common with very, very young children and also with female children. So when fight or flight isn't an option, so say when you're an infant, right, you can't run away, you can't fight someone who is hurting you. Your body goes into a dissociative response. And in this response, the body's internal opioid system is activated. And so the brain produces chemicals that mitigate pain. So it takes the pain away, alters the child's perception. It causes the child's breathing to decrease so that they calm down. And this body response actually really relaxes the child. And it creates a brain that is bathed in chemicals that make this traumatic experience more bearable. So how does this affect our children long term? When children's brains repeat these stress responses over and over, as we said, maybe even multiple times a day, depending on the situation that they are living in, the brain becomes really, really sensitive. And it takes less and less of a trigger to activate this full-on stress response. And so the result of this is that really small stressors, tiny little things that most of us would not be agitated by at all, trigger a full-blown hyperarousal response or dissociation response in kids. So this same kind of behavior can happen even if there's not a stressor, but if an experience is new. So that's another really, this was so enlightening to me when I learned this, that for kids who have really sensitized stress responses, that novel experiences can actually send their brain into a full-on stress response. So our brains don't like novelty. Our brains are actually really lazy. It wants to do things really quickly. And so if it can interpret something as a threat and then go to its preferred response, it really likes to do that, especially if it's sensitized. And so what happens is these kids have an altered system. When they've been in fight or flight or dissociation so many times over and over, then their body is very quick to send them there again. And this happens literally before the child can think. So the state of arousal that this kid has been in, even in infancy, can wire the brain in a way that they now live in an almost persistent state of fear. And that's where I pulled the name Wired for Fear for this webinar. Because as I thought about my own children and some of the challenges that we have had with my kids, I realized that sometimes things that I think of as fun and exciting really for them are just experiences that set off their fear responses. And so when we can look at development and determine that after so many traumatic stress responses, the body really becomes very hair triggered to stress and very hair triggered to novelty, so new experiences. Even a fun experience like going to Disneyland or having a birthday party, the body reacts as if that is a stress response. So because the brain is organized from the bottom up, if those lower areas of the brain are compromised, it affects development in every other area, right? The foundation of the brain has to be strong in order for the entire structure to be strong. When prenatal factors result in these poorly organized and underdeveloped brain stems, this affects everything on top of it. So thinking about the diencephalon, if the brain stem, if that lower part of the brain is not well regulated, if it's not well organized, the diencephalon will be less organized. And the diencephalon is responsible for things like sensory integration, for sleep, for feeding, for self-soothing. All of these things are things that we see in our kids, right? So because we know that the brain develops from the bottom up, these neurochemical pathways that affect mood and behavior are also affected because they begin in the low brain. The lower areas of the brain are where the neural networks for serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine originate. And we know serotonin regulates things like mood. Issues with production and absorption are closely tied with depression. Dopamine is that chemical that regulates emotion. It's tied to our reward center. So low dopamine activity is connected to things like addiction and risk-taking behavior. Norepinephrine is a brain chemical that's tied to our energy levels, to appropriate stress responses and memory. So dysfunction in these low areas of the brain, and you can see the little blue circles, these are the areas in the brain where these brain chemical systems begin. So if the low brain isn't strong, if the low brain isn't well developed, then these systems, which branch out into every part of the brain, are affected. And so we see dysfunction in multiple areas of the brain as well as systems of the body, and effects on both mental and behavioral health and physical health in many situations. Another way that having this understanding that the brain develops from the bottom up affects our kids is that all incoming sensory experiences have to begin in the low brain, right? So any kind of sensory experience, enters the brain at the lowest point. So if these areas of the brain are disorganized, this kid will have major challenges interpreting and acting on sensory signals. So kids that have lived with abuse and neglect interpret these sensory signals in ways that are really often dysfunctional. And so a lot of times we see kids who have sensory integration challenges. They react in very strange ways to external stimuli. Um, and they just have really disorganized functioning. And so they're a kid that can probably tell you, when I hear a loud sound, I shouldn't run and jump under the couch and hide. But when their body actually interprets that signal of the loud sound, they simply cannot think. Their body reacts almost immediately, and they have so much trouble regulating their behavioral responses. So I know we have talked for a long time about neuroscience, and I think some listeners have really loved it, and I bet others of you are wondering when I'm just going to get to the part where I tell you why the holidays are so miserable and give you a magic formula to make it stop. And for those of you who are in that latter group, I promise we are actually halfway there. So why are the holidays so hard for our kids, right? Why are they so hard? Well, because our kids are coping with neurodevelopmental effects of trauma, right? That trauma can be prenatal. It might be relational. It might be because they lived in constant danger or they observed abuse or violence, but all of these things affect our children's brains. So because of this, what we see in our kids are developmental gaps. And the holidays are so often about expectations, right? You know, we will think a 10-year-old should be able to sit through a church service. That's an expectation. We think the entire family needs to be posing for pictures. An expectation. All the kids in the 3rd grade should sing in the holiday show. It's an expectation, right? So why are the holidays so hard for our kids? Because our kids have relational issues. And the holidays are often about family, friends, relationships. This is hard for our children. Their brains were not wired in a way that make relationships easy. Our kids have sensitized stress responses. They are pushed into fight or flight or into dissociate and retreat by the tiniest little things. And the holidays are all about being busy. They're all about events. They're all about changes in routine. They're all about newness and surprises. And our kids' brains are wired in a way that say surprises are dangerous. Surprises are scary. Not knowing what's in that box could be dangerous. Because of our kids' disorganized and underdeveloped brainstems, so many of our kids have trouble with self-regulation. And the holidays are all about being good, or else you find yourself on the naughty list and you don't get presents like your friends or your siblings. Our kids have compromised neurochemical systems that make it so challenging for them to feel settled, to feel satisfied. These are kids that are constantly seeking out some kind of new reward. They are looking for that rush of dopamine. But the holidays are about giving. And for our kids, it seems like there's never enough. There's never enough presents. There's never enough food. There's never enough attention. And that makes it really hard for them and for us. You know, our kids are easily overwhelmed and dysregulated by sensory experiences. And the holidays are all about sensory experiences. It's all about lights and songs and smells and taste and touch. The holidays are really hard for our kids because our kids' brains are wired for fear, not fun. So, with this in mind, what can we do to help our families have more peaceful and satisfying holidays? We know that we cannot change our kids' brains by Christmas. There's lots of ways that we can strengthen our kids' brains, and I hope that we will be having some webinars talking about how can we help our kids' brains become more regulated. But for now, there are some things that we can do to help our children in the moment. You know, the first thing that we can do is to be as proactive as possible in keeping our children regulated. Kids without an organized low brain and strong self-regulation skills need to be regulated externally. And we are typically going to be that external regulator. So let's look at just a handful of proactive ways that we can help keep our kids regulated during the holidays when it feels like everything is crazy. The first one is that we have to be willing to alter our expectations. This is so tough, but in the end, it is worth every change that we make if we can keep our kids out of a place of dysregulation, or at least keep it at a place where it is less than if we wanted to do and did every holiday activity imaginable. We need to be willing to alter our expectations. Can our children handle all of the activities that we have planned? Can they do everything? How can we change some of those things? There are just a lot of ways that our family has done that. So many times we have decided not to attend an event because we just knew that one of our children was going to be too dysregulated. But one of the things that you can do is attend but be willing to leave. And that has actually made things quite easier for a lot of our kids, is that we sit in the back. If somebody needs to take a walk, say during a church service, then we can do that, right? We're just willing to alter our expectations. I've changed a lot of expectations for my children now that I understand how hard it is for them to do the things that they were expected to do. So instead of getting fancy and wearing all the Christmas finery, you know what, pair of pajamas to church is just fine in our life. So be willing to alter your expectations. A really good thing to do is sit down with your whole family and talk about what are the things that we are willing to change. What are some things we'd like to work on so that we can get them done? And what are some things that are just they're not going to be changed, but maybe we'll do them in a new way. Be willing to alter your expectations for what the holidays should be like. Maintain routines when possible, and if it's not possible, let kids know. Having long periods of unstructured time is really, really challenging for easily dysregulated children. I actually have included here a photo of my last year's Christmas schedule. So I do make pretty much an hour by hour schedule of the Christmas holidays. It is not because I want to do this. Believe me, I don't. What I want to do is lay on my couch and read a book. But if I did that and did not give my children any structure, it would be terrible. They would not enjoy the day. I would certainly not enjoy the day. And there would be lots of dysregulated kids running around. So one of the things that I do is just simply make a list. You see it there at the top. What are we going to have for lunch? What are we going to have for dinner? What are the snack options? I do like to plan an activity during the day. You know your children, and so a movie may not work for all families. And we certainly don't do that every day. But for this day, our special activity was a movie. And then who's going to be home? Because during the Christmas break, my husband worked some days, I worked other days, and some days we were home together. That was actually quite dysregulating, is who was going to be at home? What were we going to do that day? And so having a schedule that I created, and we followed it pretty well. Of course, there can certainly be room for flexibility. In fact, I think you have to be flexible. But just creating a general schedule for the day helped the children to know what was next. and it helped me to keep things moving along during the day. So just having some type of structure in your day when things are going to be different will be great. And letting kids know ahead of time, giving them lots and lots of warning whenever anything will change has been incredibly helpful for my own children. Check in with your kids far more than you think you should. Again, I grew up. This one was hard for me. They were all hard for me. They're still not easy, but I've been doing this a long time with my kiddos, and so I know now what they're going to need and when I can kind of back off and when I need more structure. But when I was growing up during the holidays, my parents told my sister and myself and all of our cousins, go play, right? And we did. We just went and played. We took care of ourselves. We came to eat when we were hungry. But for children who have been through lots of trauma, children who are easily dysregulated, go play is probably not an option. And if it is said, it's probably not going to end well. Check in with your kids more than you think you should, just to know, just to kind of give that relational bump. Hey, I'm still here. You're not on your own. Because remember, we talked about how these templates have formed. Kids who feel like they have to take care of everything on their own, they go back to that when they're stressed out. Karen Purvis said, every 2 hours, do some sensory input and connection. Do a snack, a touch, a gross motor activity. And 2 hours is, I think that's a really perfect amount of time to just check in with some real connection. Our kids need lots of connection. They need to know that you're still there, even if it's the holidays and you're upstairs and they're downstairs playing with cousins. Check in, probably more than you think you should. Provide some familiarity, even in unfamiliar settings. So for this thought, one of the things that we have done in our own home is to take food that the children already like and know into whatever setting that we're going into. So if we're going to visit other folks, if we're going to visit, if we're going to a church service where there's food afterwards, our kids get really squirrely if they think there's not going to be any food that they like. So provide some familiarity, even in these unfamiliar settings. So take the blanket, take their special blanket or a pillow, something that connects them to the things that they already know. When my oldest child went to spend the night with a friend for the first time, she was probably about 10 or 11, and she came home after that evening away and said, it's really weird being in someone else's house. Their pillow smells strange. And that just made me so aware of how tied to the familiar that our children are. Now, of course, that's something I've noticed, right? When I spend the night at someone's house or in a hotel, of course, I notice that the laundry detergent smells different. But it never occurred to me that this could be something that would make the child feel actively uncomfortable or give them some anxiety. So attempt to provide familiarity when you can. Don't force interactions. And create a quiet place for calming sensory activities. This can be really challenging at large family events, but many of our kids who have challenges with intimacy, who have challenges with attachment, get very anxious when they are forced to interact with a ton of people, especially people that they don't interact with very often, so maybe once a year. So when it's possible, don't force the interactions. You can say, I know that little Bobby is happy to see you, but he just needs to be alone for a little while. That's a really great way to sort of create that space. We want to be very careful, of course, with any kind of physical intimacy, and certainly not ever force our children to hug or kiss folks if they do not want to do that. That can be really challenging. There's a lot of family members who may want to hug and kiss, but if the child doesn't want to, we need to be very respectful of that. Many of these kids have had boundaries crossed in the past with their personal space. They may have been violated in sexual and physical ways. And so we do not want to force physical interactions with children. Creating a place for calming activities too can include bringing with you something like a sensory box. So creating a box or a bag that has many sensory activities in it. It can have things like noise canceling headphones, and those can be headphones so they can listen to music, but they could even be just ear protection. We have purchased in the past hunting ear protection. It blocks out enough ambient sound that it makes the child more comfortable, but they can still hear the sound of your voice. So being aware of what your kiddos' sensory triggers are, how much alone time they need, how much calming downtime they need, and then what facilitates that, what makes downtime helpful for this child. Is it that it's quiet? Is it that they have a blanket? Is it that they have Play-Doh to squish or some type of fidget with them? Be aware of all of those possibilities for your kiddo and create that space for them. Again, know what calms your kid and bring it with you. This is all about testing, right? It's about seeing what works for each child. I am the queen of fidgets at my house. I have baskets all over the house with different types of fidgets in them. When we travel, I usually just put them in a Ziploc bag and bring them with me. I also just carry them in my purse for if we're at restaurants. For some kids, a fidget just can distract just enough. For other kids, it is something as specific as having ear protection or noise canceling headphones. For others, it can be things like sunglasses. There are kids who are really upset and who cannot cope with bright light. So having a pair of sunglasses with you, make sure that you bring it with you when you go to your mother-in-law's, because they may not have what you need. I'm certainly not saying that from experience. And then let your family and friends know that things may look different for your family. I've included, if you look in the handouts section, a letter that you can feel free to utilize and change in any way that you want and share with your friends and family. It's okay to tell people that the holidays for you may need to be a little different. You may need to leave a giant celebration where things are very loud or where people are making a lot of noise. You may need to leave a celebration earlier because your children get too dysregulated if they miss their bedtime. What we have to do as parents of children who came to us already hurt is we have to set up ways to assist them so that they can do their best. And part of that may mean doing things differently than we have in the past. So let your friends and families know that life may look a little different. Some families are so wonderful with that, want to accommodate. Other families find it really, really challenging. And so sometimes it's easier to do it in a written way. So feel free to use that letter and mail it or send it in an email with the accommodations that you or your children need. So some of these strategies are actually pretty challenging as a parent. You know, setting up I don't even know I haven't even looked at my calendar, so I'm not sure how long Christmas break is this year. Probably about 10 days. Setting up an hour by hour calendar for 10 days is really exhausting. Um, it's a lot. It's a challenge. It takes up a lot of energy. Um, and sometimes, in order to parent kids who are affected by trauma, we have to make major shifts in our own parenting beliefs, and our own approaches, and sometimes even in our own worldview. One of the things that I regularly remind myself is that my children are doing the best they can. And this is a huge shift in worldview. I grew up in a culture and a family and a religion that certainly did not believe people did the best that they can. But in order to parent my children in a way that has helped them to grow and to be the best they can, I really have to believe and do believe they are doing the best they can, and that my job is to support that growth. And so this can require huge personal shifts, huge personal sacrifice, huge amount of energy and change and research and learning. The fact that there are close to 200 people just listening to this call says that parenting kids from tough places, from traumatic beginnings, requires something that's different. Because of this, parents require a great deal of self-care. A great deal of self-care. And I am not talking about the kind of self-care that we hear about a lot, like make sure you plan a massage or get a coffee date. This is not the kind of self-care I'm talking about. Although that might be a part of it, the kind of self-care that we need as parents of traumatized kids is to care for ourselves in a way that we have the ability to be self-regulated, right? That we can be well-regulated human beings when our children cannot. I keep this this little graphic in my home. This is a graphic that I saw during my time of study in NMT, but I think it was maybe about 8 months ago. And when I saw it, I was like, I get this. This makes so much sense to me. So what we see is that arousal continuum, right? That kids move from calm to terror when they're faced with that stress, with a stressor, that they move up this arousal continuum. Well, this particular graphic adds something here. It shows the child where they're at on the continuum, but it shows the caregiving adult. What is so interesting to me is that wherever the adult is on this continuum, their child is higher on the arousal continuum. So what this means is when I, as mom, am at alert, right? When I'm at alert, when I'm late for work, let's say, and I know I need to go, I have something to do, I have plans that I've got to do, my kid is feeding off of that. My kid is feeding off of where I am on this continuum, and he's higher than I am, right? So if I'm at alert, he's at alarm, right? If I'm moving up that continuum and I'm getting more agitated, my child is also moving up that continuum. And so in order to parent these children in the best way that we can, we have to be incredibly mindful of our own regulation. I could go back. I mean, we could spend 3 hours or more tonight just talking about times that my kid's meltdown was my fault, right? That the meltdown and the problem really had very little to do with the child and more to do with me. We could all probably talk about many times that happened. What we have to do as parents to hurt kids is care for ourselves in a way that we are okay. Our kids can't be okay when we're not okay. And so I want to look at, for the next few minutes, just a handful of things that we can do to help ourselves be okay during this season. I'm certainly, and I want everyone listening to know, I'm certainly not saying our children's behavioral challenges are our fault or that we are responsible for all their behaviors. However, if we can think back, um, I think about the times my kids had the most problems were times like when I was not prepared very well in the morning and I was tired. And so I just want us to know that when we're doing okay, it's so much easier for us to meet our kids' needs and for them to stay regulated. So here's some holiday self-care. You know, allow yourself to grieve. The truth is, the holidays look different in my life because I'm parenting 4 traumatized kids. They look different. And that's sad. It's sad because certain folks that I care about um, maybe don't want to hang out with us anymore. It's sad because I had a vision of what Christmas should look like with children, and my Christmas doesn't look like that. There may be grief in your life too over the should have beens. Allow yourself to grieve the perfect holidays. But at the same time, don't camp out there. If we camp out in the should have beens, we're not going to enjoy what is. Um, and the truth is, the longer that we are working with our kids, the more we work with them, the more we teach them self regulation, the more regulated we are, the easier it is. And so many of those things later can be done. Allow yourself to grieve what could have been. But don't build, don't pitch a tent and camp there. It's not a great place to be. Let something go and rest. This one is really my favorite. I've gotten to a point in my life where I can let a lot of things go. Life isn't Pinterest. Parenting kids is not about the pictures you get to put on your Facebook. The holidays are not about the number of likes you're going to get on Instagram. And if they are, you'll probably be miserable because things need to be a little different for us and for our families. You don't have to get pictures in matching clothes just because your sister does, right? You don't have to have a tree that looks perfect just because your neighbor does. It's okay to let some things go and rest. In our family, we certainly have changed the way that we celebrated the holidays. It is silly for me at this point to cook tons and tons of food because my children won't eat it, and then I feel frustrated, right? So I've let that go and I rest. Instead, I make tons of appetizers. So there's a lot of sausage balls, there's a lot of pretzels, there's a lot of dips and cheese balls, and they are just as happy with that. Would I like to have the huge feast? Sure. But that's not something that my children need now, and it makes things more challenging if I'm focused on that type of cooking instead of being focused on what else is going on in my home. So determine, what is it this holiday season that I can let go? Is it even having the gifts wrapped and under the tree? My children, when they first came, my first 2 kiddos, when they came to live with me, I wrapped everything and put under the tree. In about 15 minutes, they had already unwrapped everything. It was done. It wasn't even Christmas yet. And so after that, the way that we put presents out was even different. So we changed that. Let something go and rest. Don't make it a constant battle. Change the environment and enjoy things more. Um, Practice saying no. This is a real tough one for me personally. I love to say yes. I love to help. It's probably a little bit because I'm a busybody and want to be up in everything, but practice saying no. The busier that we are, the less regulated that we are. The holidays are already a time of great busyness. And certainly from my own experience, I can say the times I have not responded well to my kids were times when I felt busy rushed, and that my own needs weren't met. And so I try really hard to avoid being busy, rushed, and not having my needs met. And one of the ways that you can do that is by saying no. It's okay to not participate in every event. It's okay to not see every parade, right? There's lots that you can do. Make the things that you do with your family be things that you really enjoy instead of saying yes to everything, instead of being involved in everything. Figure out what is best for my family and practice saying no to things that you know will not work for you. The final one here for self-care is reclaim a beloved tradition. For many families, traditions that they cared about needed to be changed for the benefit of their children. A family that I talked to several years ago said that they attempted to do the elf on the shelf in their home, and that it really freaked out their child. The kid was really, really anxious and scared about elf on a shelf, and so they didn't do it for a while. And so there's often things we're going to have to give up for our kids. Other families say they don't even do the concept of Santa Claus at Christmas because the idea of someone coming into the house after dark, someone who is watching you, was too frightening for their children. So we may have to give up some traditions in order to parent our children well. But one of the things that we can do is reclaim a tradition, change it, make it work for your family. In my family, I loved the tradition of setting up the tree with the whole family, putting our ornaments on, playing Christmas music, enjoying that, and then typically we would go shopping afterwards. That was really fun for me. When my family was complete, my current family, with my 4 children, I attempted to recreate this. And the whole day was nothing but chaos. So we have um, a fake Christmas tree, an artificial tree, and just pulling it out of the box was like, kids were screaming, they were dysregulated, they were jumping all over the place. They couldn't understand why it was in multiple parts and pieces. And then they were so frustrated because they wanted to put the ornaments on, but the tree wasn't even ready yet. The lights weren't on. It was really a disaster, and it was very sad. And I don't quite remember. I think maybe I've blocked it out, but I know there was crying, and a lot of it involved me and not just the kids. So after that year, my husband and I thought, well, we'll try it again next year. It'll be better. We'll talk about it for a few days ahead of time. It was not better. So what we did is we decided that in the evening, after the children were asleep, we would put out the tree and do all the hard stuff. So we put the artificial tree up, we got the lights on, we got everything ready. We moved the furniture that needed to be moved, like all that stuff was done. And then when the children woke up, there was the tree without any ornaments on it. And then we gave each of them a bag of ornaments that those then became their ornaments, and they were able to place the ornaments anywhere they wanted on the tree, which again meant doing some of that let something go and rest, which is mom didn't go back and move the ornaments so they looked prettier. It worked beautifully, and that is still what we do now, is that we put up the tree in the evening. The next morning, the bags are out with the ornaments, and the kids are able to then put their own ornaments on. And now that my children are getting older and they are more regulated, this can change. And so maybe next year when my son is 13, he'll be able to help put the tree together. That would be a great skill for him, is to be able to get the tree out of the box and unpack it. But for years, that didn't work. And so instead of making it something that I was depressed about, that made Christmas terrible, I just really had to think about, how can I reclaim this tradition in a way that works for our family? And so I really encourage you to to reclaim something this holiday season, something that maybe hasn't worked for you in the past. How can you do it in a new way and reclaim it? You can also reclaim it by doing it after your kids are in bed, right? The holidays aren't just for the children, they're also for you. So if there's something that you are missing, give yourself that gift. Do that for yourself. My husband and I have a tradition that we consistently have followed through with every year since our children came to us. On Christmas Eve, we watch the movie Die Hard together and put together everything Santa has brought and place it under the tree. So to me, that part of the Christmas season is just as fun as watching the kids open their gift, right? We have this special time together, enjoying a silly movie and having fun thinking about what will happen the next day. So try to reclaim something that may have been lost in seasons past this year. So to close out tonight, I really want to encourage you to give yourself some gifts this holiday season. I want you to give yourself the gift of viewing your children's behavior through a neurodevelopmental lens. For some of you, this may be very, very new, and it may be a very challenging way to see what's going on with your kids. For others of you, you may already understand this, and this may be part of the way that you already interact with your children, but I just encourage you to think about the challenges that your kids are up against. So the first gift is to view your kids' behavior through a neurodevelopmental lens. The second gift that I want you to give yourself is the gift of making the holidays more regulating for your kids. And we talked about some ways to do that, but more importantly than the ways I am telling you are the ways that you will think of yourself, because you know your children, you know their triggers, you know their needs, but attempt to make the holidays more regulating for your kids. And the last, and frankly, the most important gift I want you to give yourself this holiday season is the gift of real self-care. Again, this might mean taking a bubble bath and going on a date and calling a friend. But even more than that, I want you to care for yourself so that you are enjoying the life that you currently have. And this is a huge lens change. It's tough to enjoy your life, when your kid is throwing shoes at you. I really get it. I've been there. Sometimes I'm still there, and I get it. But attempt to find ways to really love the life that you have in spite of your children's behavior sometimes. So give yourself that real self-care so that you can help your children co-regulate. I really appreciate you guys joining me this evening. I certainly hope that you can carry this information. I know it's been a lot, and it's really late for some of us. And so I hope that you can synthesize all of this and think about what will work for you and your family and take it into the next week, which I'm sure will be very busy for you, and then bring it into the new year. So I am going to go and complete my children's hour by hour schedule for the evening, and I hope that you all have a great night. Thanks for joining us.